Okay, so let's begin tonight, as usual, on page 73 with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that we'll recite 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Go forward to either 97 or 98 for the short mandala offering prayer. We just do that first verse and then the offering mantra. That's on page 98. And then after that, continuing on 98, Refuge in Bodhicitta, once in English and then twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi peso namgi dola penchir sangye drupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyangi pe sonamgi dola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, then let's do a short meditation before we begin the class. Find a good meditation posture and work with the breath over these next few minutes in whatever way is suitable for your mind. In any of our meditations on the breath, we're trying to bring our minds to a heightened sense of attention, awareness of the breath, trying to stay present with the breath as best as we can, not letting the mind wander, but certainly the mind will wander. And when that happens, the job then is to notice that that's occurred and to correct the meditation, to move the mind back to the object, back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation for being here tonight. And to do this tonight, let's reflect briefly on the kindness of all sentient beings. In the traditional teachings in the Lam Rim, we think about sentient beings as having been kind in a particular way, as having been our dear mothers, since we have had countless rebirths, and every single sentient being, therefore, has been in that role of showing us the kind attention of a caring mother for her dear child. But we can also reflect on the ways that sentient beings, even in this very lifetime, are involved in our welfare. Those that we benefit from directly in our lives, we can certainly acknowledge their kindness very easily. Those who do care for us in the variety of ways, who contribute to our welfare. But also there are countless other beings that are involved in our welfare indirectly, producing the food that we eat, all the various possessions that we have. There are countless beings that are involved in just helping us to be alive every day, to have the joys, the pleasures that we do experience, the comfort that we have. Without those sentient beings performing those roles, we wouldn't have those things. So while they don't intend to be kind, they still are showing us an incredible kindness. We can also reflect on how even those people who are difficult in our lives, if we use them as a platform for our practice of patience, tolerance, our extending our heart further through deeper love and compassion, especially for those who are difficult. In this way, we can see these beings as showing us a kindness, because they are helping us to grow, to strengthen our own spiritual path, to be able to enlarge our intention, our desire to benefit others, and so on. So whether somebody is directly involved in our welfare, indirectly involved, or actually even seeming to be counter to our welfare, we can see them all through the lens of kindness. We can see every single sentient being as having shown us immeasurable kindness in this lifetime and countless other lifetimes, in the variety of roles that they have played in supporting us, in helping us to have the happiness that we've experienced. And moreover, every one of these beings is kind as being the support for this mind of bodhicitta. Without these beings, we could never become enlightened. We need them. We need them as the object of our great love, our great compassion, our desire to become a Buddha for their sake. So with this immense gratitude for all sentient beings and acknowledgement and appreciation of their incredible kindness, think that you're going to be here tonight with a mind that seeks only to benefit them and to never harm them. And you're going to do this through cultivating the mind of bodhicitta, the sincere desire to develop your own potential to the greatest degree, to become a Buddha, so you can then help each and every one of them faultlessly, perfectly, so they can attain that state as well. And it's for this reason that we're going to continue our exploration of this topic of minds and mental factors. Okay. So in the last class, we're working our way through these 6 root afflictions, and we went through both attachment and anger in the text. I haven't shared the slides on anger that are from Geshe Rabtin's text. And we also, as I'm going through each of these on the afflictions, I want to talk a bit about how we antidote them. What are the states of mind that we develop that will act counter to those, that will actually help to diminish the strength of the afflictions? And of course, we don't eliminate all the afflictions until we eliminate their root, but we will get to talking about the root of all of our afflictions either later tonight or certainly in the next class when we go on to ignorance, which is also one of the 6 root afflictions. So any questions up to this point? We've covered up to page 55 of the text. Before I go to Geshe Rabtin's slides on anger, it'll help us to review what we did talk about in regard to anger. All right, let's go to the slides. Let me share on screen here with the folks online. So again, the 6 mental factors that we're looking at that are called the root afflictions. The 3 that are generally identified as also given that label of root afflictions are the first, second, and fourth: attachment, anger, and ignorance. But we also include in this listing pride, doubt, and by doubt, as we'll see, we mean an afflicted form of doubt, not the doubt that is a healthy part of our process of learning. And then afflicted views that we have that have some misunderstanding to them, and by virtue of that, they become problematic for us. So let's look at the slides in particular that Geshe Rabtin has from his book, Mind and Its Functions. I think these are always quite useful to review these topics, and he does sometimes share some different things. Anger is a distinct mental factor that, in reference to one of 3 objects, we saw this last week, agitates the mind through being unable to bear or through intending to cause harm to the object. It has the function of disturbing and roughening the mind. So the 3 objects will be talked about then in the next, I inserted something here. What I should have done is I should have moved this slide. We'll get to that slide in a moment. What I inserted here is from, we saw the 9 bases of malice. Of course, I could have called it that as well. But remember on page 54 of our text, we had this verse from Precious Garland, the 5th chapter, verse 31. It says, harmful intent arises from 9 causes of intending to harm others, senseless misgivings in the 3 realms, or 3 times, with regard to oneself, one's friends, and one enemy. So we have 9 that are involved with the 3 times the 3 objects with regard to oneself, one's friends, and one enemies. And last week I said that we would be angered when our enemies got what they wanted. Well, it's a little more specific than that, according to Geshe Jampa Tekchok's explanation in this new book that it's been out for maybe about a year now. The text of Nagarjuna's Precious Garland has been available in translation by Jeffrey Hopkins for a long time, but the Venerable Thupten Chodron has put together this book called Practical Ethics and Profound Emptiness. That's all of Geshe Jampa Tekchok's commentary on all 500 verses of this text. So what he says here, let's go back to, whoops, right there, is that harmful intent is what he's calling, that's again what it was in our text as well on page 54 in this verse. Harmful intent is ill will and malice. It's a form of anger. We could say that this is definitely a strengthened kind of mental intention that is at the root of our anger. It arises from 9 causes. 1 to 3 are with respect to ourselves. We think he harmed me, is harming me, or will harm me. So it's again the past, present, and future tenses with regard to others harming ourselves. Then with respect to our friends and relatives, we think she harmed my dear ones, is harming my dear ones, or will harm my dear ones. So that's the second object, our friends and relatives, and have the 3 times there as well. Past harms, present harms, future harms. The third one, though, where it was a little bit more refined in Geshe Jampa Tekchok's explanation, he says, in relation to our enemies or the people we don't like, we think he helped my enemy, is helping my enemy, or will help my enemy. When we are thinking any one of these 9 thoughts, our minds become deeply disturbed and we want to harm the other person. So he was talking about it more as not just when your enemies get what they want, but when you actually have people who are helping your enemies, and then they become the object of your scorn, your anger, because they are helping the people that you don't like. So it's those who are harming you, those who are harming your friends, or those who are helping your enemies become the object of your anger in regard to these 9 causes or bases of malice. All right? So that was just a little clarification, because I noticed that when I went to this text, remembered that I had that, because I actually will be using some of this book as well when we get to pride, because there are a number of verses in the same chapter, the 5th chapter on pride. Any questions on that before we move on? Okay. So now back to Geshe Rabten. So again, it should have started, I moved that all, or put that all in the beginning, but I thought I had put it before that initial slide. So Geshe Rabten was introducing what anger is according to, again, the mind and its functions. And he says it acts as a basis for tormenting both oneself and others, and is a contributory condition for the increase of suffering and its causes. When we become angry, it is usually with regard to one of 3 objects. So this is where the 3 objects are set out, but these 3 are different than what we just saw in terms of the 9 bases of malice. These were from our text as well. The being or object by whom we are being harmed, the suffering that occurs through our being harmed, or the reasons for which we are being harmed, which is saying it a little bit different than I think the way we had it in our text. I think the sources of our harm was what was referred to in the text, which would be the things that are actually harming us. So, the words or the physical objects or whatever it is that is the object of that harm. So again, nonetheless, the reasons for which we are being harmed could also be an object, I suppose, of why we would become angry. Just as attachment over-exaggerates the attractiveness of the object, anger is a mistaken conception that over-exaggerates the displeasing aspect of its object. So again, we do have, in regard to these 2, I often talk about them as this is generally what's going on in our day, right? We are experiencing something pleasant, and then we're getting quite attached to it. Or we're experiencing something unpleasant, and we're becoming quite averse to it, pushing it out of our lives. Both of those patterns, again, are when the delusions are present, we are superimposing more pleasantness or unpleasantness than what is actually there. We will say that definitely there is an unpleasant feeling in regard to those particular objects and a pleasant one. We can say that that exists, but the level at which it exists and the level at which anger or attachment thinks that it exists is, those are very different. Our minds are engaged in a whole process of imagination when it comes to that. So when we acknowledge that there's just this simple feeling that is occurring, a feeling of pleasantness, a feeling of unpleasantness, sometimes that's enough to stop the delusions from arising, because we can just see it as a passing experience, that we have that mental unhappiness or that mental happiness, and we don't want to get too caught up in either one of them. But this is our habitual reaction to these two types of experiences. Of course, we have a third type of experience that was mentioned briefly when we talked about attachment, which was, actually, it wasn't attachment, it was in the previous section on virtue and non-virtue, which is neutrality. You know, we do have neutral experiences, those experiences that aren't registering anything as pleasant or unpleasant. And at those times, we just kind of zone out. We don't really do much in terms of, maybe we just make a duller mind, a more ignorant mind. But these are the two main ones that become quite powerful for us, is those pleasant things that we exaggerate and we pull into our lives, and then the unpleasant things that we also exaggerate, but we push them out of our lives. Then Geshe Rabdin continues, he says that anger causes us to see certain people or things in a very disagreeable and unpleasing light. Thus, the way in which we relate to one another is frequently colored by the fabrication of subjective mental images that completely distort the reality of the situation. So again, in the first part of mind and this course, we call it generally minds and awarenesses, or awarenesses and knowers. This is, again, we're in the second part, which is mind and mental factors. And in the first part, which we're not sure if we're going to go to after we finish this, we may, it's more Buddhist epistemology, kind of how the mind knows. And that's where we talk about conceptual minds versus minds that directly perceive things like our senses and so on. But what's happening in this, I'm just explaining that as part of this phrase here, subjective mental images. We fabricate these various mental images. Mental images are the way that our conceptual mind knows. This is what is one of the subjects that's talked about at length in that course. That first part, other part of this awarenesses and knowers. The conceptual mind is always dealing with things through a mental image. So again, if you think about the food that you ate for, earlier today, any of the meals that you had, if you bring that image to mind of that food, and you can even bring the taste to mind of that food, or the, other aspects of that, the smell of it, and so on. That image that you have in your mind right now, that you're working with through conceptuality, isn't the exact object. It's a sort of a mirror of the object and related to the object, but it's not the actual object itself. And of course, our conceptual minds are where we run into most of the problems, because we bring in those images and we overlay all kinds of stuff around them. We tell stories about them. We fabricate all kinds of peripheral things with them. And so this is how we actually create so many of our problems. All of the afflictions are stories. They're conceptual minds. And they are involved in a whole conceptual process. We think about something, we overlay all kinds of other ideas on it, we make it so much worse than it is in the case of anger, and then we have this angry thought towards it, the wish to harm whatever it was that was causing us to be upset. So this is what's going on with our conceptual mind. Of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, we emphasize the power of the conceptual mind to undo all of this as well. Because when we have an awareness that this is happening and we introduce these antidotal thoughts, we can actually bring more accurate thinking into our minds. We can actually have correct mental images of what's going on. So conceptuality isn't a problem in and of itself. Conceptuality is a problem only in terms of the wrong thinking that we engage in, the ways in which we are fabricating these things. But they distort the reality of the situation. I mean, look at how many times we've had somebody do something to us, and as we sat there stewing in our juices, we've created a whole fiction, a whole story about what that person is, who they are, made them into somebody who's probably not like them at all, most likely. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever seen World War I propaganda against Germany,
Oh.
it's really amazing like that. I mean, they call them the Hun, that they have, it's almost like beasts, or, almost like out of a horror film or something like that.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
And apparently it was terribly effective.
Yeah.
People really thought that way about the Germans. It was amazing propaganda.
Yeah.
And it was just, if you see it, you almost laugh at it now.
Yeah.
But I think at the time, all this exaggeration.
Right. Yeah, and you could say even in Hitler's time, the propaganda about Jews and what have you in Nazi Germany, So Bob was just mentioning, in World War I and the propaganda against, the Germans at that time. But I mean, it happens all the time in the world. I mean, this is how political causes are created, is that people go to war on the basis of an entire fiction. Well, not entire. Again, there are events that occur. We can't deny that there's some basis sometimes. Just like with anger and our own situations, our own experiences, there is something unpleasant that happens. but the stories we tell ourselves about that and the things we add on and create from our own imagination are pretty outlandish. So, we have to be aware that this is the process that's going on. So if we do go on to that course, it's an interesting way to examine what's happening in our minds. What are the processes by which we know things? And that's one of the main things I kind of encapsulated in a few sentences, but we go into obviously a lot more detail about the whole process of how do we go from a wrong awareness of understanding things in an incorrect way to generating the most correct mind that we can, which is not just conceptual, but even goes beyond that. Eventually, we do transcend conceptuality. That is one of the practices in all Buddhist traditions, is to eventually let go of the confines of the conceptual mind, because anytime we are thinking about things, we still are not getting at that reality. The process of conceptuality doesn't allow us to know things directly. So eventually we do have to transcend conceptuality, but conceptuality can be, and again in this tradition, is a major part of our progress along the path. Our ability to think more correctly, to know things more correctly. And that's why we're here in this course, is to be able to understand what's going on with our minds and all the ways that we're creating our own problems through our own, again, delusion, our own not knowing the way things exist, and so on. Let's move on to a few more slides from Geshe Rabten. He says, when under the influence of attachment, people and objects appear artificially appealing and beautiful. And when under the influence of anger, they appear artificially displeasing and ugly. These two basic distortions only give rise to frustration and despair. Again, we talked about attachment and the difficulty of overcoming it, because we don't necessarily mind all the artificially appealing and beautiful stuff. That is kind of where we want to be. We want to see the world in that light, but of course it's a fabrication, because we are also superimposing a lot of other ideas around it, right? When we get into tantric teachings, in tantra you're trying to hold a view of every being in this divine state of being an enlightened being, and the entire world transform and so on. That's a different way of looking at things as being appealing and beautiful, because we're trying not to overcome our ignorance and attachment and so on. But this mind of attachment is overlaying what isn't there on objects, but it's more over grasping at that, wanting to have that, wanting not to let go of it, and putting an expectation on it that's completely unrealistic. Because these objects can't satisfy it to the degree that attachment believes that they can. And of course, anger is doing the same type of exaggeration, but because it's something that is unpleasing, we want to push it out of our lives. We want to, do whatever we can to be separated from it. So these two, attachment and anger, as I mentioned last week, are often talked about together because they are kind of flip sides of the same thing. We have this default mode of always wanting that desirous thing in our lives, but then we get frustrated whenever we don't have that, or we have the opposite of that, something that we don't desire. So Geshe Rabten talks about these two as being the origins of all conflict, from the fighting between two ants, the quarreling between a man and his wife, up to full-scale international wars. When we are disturbed by strong attachment or anger, we always tend to think that the good or bad qualities we see are intrinsic properties of the object. So we didn't mention that as part of the definition of anger. Remember, with attachment, we did say that attachment holds those qualities to be intrinsic within the object, that there is that level of distortion that's going on. But it's the same for anger. It's seeing the unpleasantness as intrinsic to the object. And we can see again that those are not intrinsic to the object, because not everybody has the same experience of those objects. Even the things that we find unpleasant. There are some things that many people will find unpleasant, but not everyone finds unpleasant. Or even when you go from human beings to other animals, what have you, we can find beings who might be attracted to the things that we find repulsive as human beings. So this is, again, nothing kind of set from the side of the object, and that is speaking to some degree of its lack of inherent existence, which once more is going to be what the mind of ignorance is adhering to the opposite of, believing that things actually have an intrinsic identity and intrinsic qualities within them. So Geshe Rabten continues saying, hence we engage in attempting to either physically possess or physically hurt and destroy the object. So it's one or the other. If it's something beautiful, delightful that we find, pleasing to us, then we want to possess it, not let it go, continue to have it in our lives. Or if it's something that's the opposite, We want to get rid of it. In fact, we are merely being bewildered and deluded by our own imagination, and however much we strive to secure happiness on this basis, we shall never succeed. So this is the big problem with it. Again, the Buddha doesn't say that there's kind of something flawed about our desire to be happy or a desire to not suffer, which is kind of what is the underlying motivation of these two reactions. The problem are those reactions, that those reactions don't get us to what we want. If they did, then we'd be happy already and we would be free from suffering already. But instead, we keep going back to those patterns and they never really do the real task. So he said, it is essential, therefore, to recognize that the source of all pleasure and pain lies within the internal workings of our minds. Of course, this is something we try to emphasize from the very beginning in Buddhist teachings, is that we can't put all of the onus on the external world. The external world does play some role. But we can see once more that the external role isn't the defining factor, because many people can have great peace of mind even in the midst of very disastrous situations in their lives. And people can also have very disturbed and negative minds in the face of even the most delightful things going on in their lives. So the mind has the greater primacy. It does have the ability to determine, what we are actually experiencing, regardless of what's going on outside. So the source of all pleasure and pain does lie within the internal workings of our own minds. Of course, this is played out in the principle of karma as well. Karma is the means by which we have particular experiences through our own actions of the past that cause us to have pleasure or pain upon meeting various objects in the world or what have you. So in dividing anger, again, we did talk about various divisions of this. We can talk of lesser, middling, and greater degrees of anger. This is kind of new from Geshe Rabten, as well as anger caused by harm being done to oneself, to one's friends, or to those with whom one sides. This is a little bit different presentation as well. The first two were the same: oneself, one's friends, to those with whom one sides. I guess those are just, again, an extension of friends to be even people that we have some commonality with. But again, this is just another division that I haven't seen anywhere else. I'm not sure, again, where Geshe Rabten got that from. But furthermore, by regarding the second classification in terms of the three times, that is, anger caused by harm inflicted in the past, harm being inflicted at present, or harm liable to be inflicted in the future to oneself, to one's friends, and so forth, we distinguish 9 types of anger. So he does a similar thing, but again, in the previous slide, as I showed, it was with those with whom one sides. But again, I don't know that it's a huge difference, but the text that we have in front of us, again, speaks to those people who are helping our enemies. But anyway, yeah.
Actually, I find it really interesting when they talk about
Uh-huh.
because in reality, it does function like that. Normally, we think about anger. Somebody did something to us now.
Right.
But historically, people remember things that happened 5 centuries ago, and they're still angry about it. Like about their country.
This is true.
And people think about, people do think about the future, what the other person's going to get or not get, and that makes them really angry.
Exactly.
So actually, all 3 times.
Yeah. So Bob's just pointing out how, we can really observe anger in our own minds or when we see it in others and acknowledge these 3 times are all objects of our anger. It's not just what people did in the past or what we're experiencing in the present, but as you pointed out, even future anticipation of harm that will befall us or help that our enemies will get or what have you. So yeah, I think this is pretty insightful to look at anger in this way. So let me take off the share here and let's talk a little bit about how we work with anger. In his commentary, Venerable George Chernoff, monk in our tradition, he was here in April, was it? August, I think it was August. It was while I was away, but I did stop in and met him briefly. I don't think I've met him before. Anyway, he's got an entire commentary on this text. And in his commentary, he talks about 4 main ways that he emphasizes to work with anger, but there are even more than that. Just quiz the audience. Does anyone know what's an effective way to counteract anger? What is a sort of antidote to anger? Stephen?
You can think of the downsides of being angry, just
Okay.
how it changes your physical aspect.
Good, good. So Stephen's saying that there are those sort of disadvantages or the downside of anger. We can talk about them physically in terms of what it does to the body, the blood pressure going up, the heart racing, the adrenaline, all of those sorts of things. Talk about it mentally in terms of the agitation that one feels, no sense of peace or calm. Sometimes it's even very hard to think when we're angry, right? We don't feel like there's such a wide array of things we can choose from. We're just on one track, which just keeps taking us deeper into it. So that's definitely part of it. Remember last week, I think I emphasized how sometimes that almost every one of these, we could think about the disadvantages of that particular delusion. And that's maybe enough for us to turn away from it. May not be enough. We may need additional thoughts. Bob, you were going to share one?
Yeah, I think the main end of love. And I mean, another thing to think of too would be shame. Here we are trying to be bodhisattvas.
Right.
And how shameful it is to want to harm people.
Yeah. So Bob is emphasizing the more traditional one towards against anger or hatred would be love. If there's a being who is the object of that, as we've seen, the beings are identified as one of the main objects, those who are harming ourselves or those that we love or helping our enemies, that we try to generate love for that being, which means seeing them through that lens. This is a very hard one. This isn't something we can turn on immediately. We have to have a lot of training in loving kindness to be able to think about them through that lens, to see them as an object of our wish for them to be happy, for them to not suffer, what have you. And then also, I'm sorry, the shame. Shame and embarrassment, right? We remember when we talked about those as virtuous mental factors. Self-respect and consideration for others were another way that we could talk about those two. Those are often what helps us to not go down these pathways of all these delusions. If we sit there and go, oh yeah, as Bob was saying, I'm trying to be a bodhisattva, I'm trying to practice this path of enlightening all sentient beings, and here I am following this mind of anger that wants to harm that being. Well, that's totally antithetical to what bodhicitta is about, and we should feel some sense of shame that we're allowing ourselves to engage in that state of mind. If we had any respect for ourselves and our own wish to achieve this goal, then we need to abandon that mind right away. Again, these can be also very powerful factors for us. So definitely the disadvantages was talked about, I think, by, actually that one wasn't one of what Venerable George said, but that is on Kathleen MacDonald's wonderful list from How to Meditate. She's got 10 different things that all can be used in some way to combat anger. The love and compassion that Bob mentioned is definitely one that Venerable George also highlighted. Again, this is a more traditional one, particularly when we are dealing with another being. If you're angry at a computer or a phone or something like that, then you can't have loving kindness for that, I suppose. I mean, maybe you could, but it's not quite the same thing. But you have to maybe think about other things that might antidote your anger. Yeah, good, Mary. Patience. Especially to think that this is your opportunity to practice patience. We don't get handed this every moment of the day, probably thankfully. If we had days where everybody was doing something that was opposed to us, that everything was unpleasant, we were constantly being tormented, then that would be another situation. But we don't get that many opportunities really to practice patience, most of us. I mean, some of you may have exceptional lives where you do get that more frequently, but most of us, we need those people in our lives, right? These are wonderful opportunities for us to be more patient. Not that we should be encouraging them to be that way for us, egging them on, poking the bear, making them angrier and angrier so that we can have all these wonderful beings to practice patience with. It's just that when they do appear in our lives, we have to recognize that that is one of the opportunities that we have currently in front of us, to practice patience right now, to be able to work with calming our minds, staying undisturbed in the face of harm. Let me share a few more of what were on Venerable George's list first. So one of the first ones that he emphasized is what he calls the arrow and the target, which is the whole idea of remembering karma. Of course, why do we experience something unpleasant? Whether it be something caused by another being or whether it be something that comes into our lives, such as an illness or any other loss, what have you. It's because we created the karma for it. We've set up the target. The arrow is now hitting us. Of course, we created the arrow too, right? We're the creator of all of this. Now, again, when you have another being involved in that, it's not to say that they aren't doing what they're doing. They are doing what they're doing, and they're frequently doing it with a deluded mind. So we're not denying that, but they are simply a condition for us to experience the ripening of our own karma. If we hadn't created our own karma, there's no way that we could experience it. That being would never harm us if we hadn't set up the target, if we hadn't created the arrow. So we are involved in the process from the very beginning. And of course, that can lessen the feeling of wanting to blame the other person, which is often behind a lot of anger, right? You know, because we get angry because we think there's no rationale for them doing this to us. How dare they do this to us, right? This is often behind our mind of anger frequently, right? So if we think from the point of view of, oh, this is my karma coming back home, you know, to roost. This is that wonderful text we've studied here before, the wheel of sharp weapons that I've sent out, and now it's coming back to cut me. Well, then we have a bit more acceptance of that. And we don't feel the tendency to lash out at the other person because we see that they're involved, they're doing what they're doing, but we are the ones who set it up in the first place. So again, the teachings on karma can be really, really useful. The second one that he talks about is the idea of impermanence, which actually is kind of interesting. It wasn't on Kathleen MacDonald's list. Venerable Sangye Kadro is her ordained name. She uses impermanence in some other places, but impermanence is a very powerful one when we're experiencing something unpleasant, right? Because we know every one of us has had countless unpleasant experiences already in this lifetime. Are any of them still lasting? You know, they come and go. We have them come into our lives, that awful driver or whatever, and then the driver drives off and we don't see them again. You know, things come in and out, and this idea that they will pass can frequently be also a very effective antidote to not go down that pathway. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, impermanence in my mind is often almost, in many cases, almost equivalent to emptiness.
Yeah.
We have a notion that our
Yeah.
enemy is inherently our enemy.
Yeah.
And will permanently be our enemy forever. And
Right.
we realize that just positive conditions are our enemy now, maybe later in our life, they'll be a friend.
Yeah. Yeah, Bob is pointing out that this can also be kind of correlated with emptiness, because when we have that mind of clinging to this permanent enemy, this unchanging enemy that's going to continue to be there, it's frequently combined with the ignorance that is adhering to them in that way, not just as being permanent, but as also being inherently existent. And actually, Venerable George, in his second time coming around and explaining, you know, that one in particular, he includes emptiness in there. Certainly, remembering emptiness for any of these can be a very effective tool. It is the ultimate antidote. Once more, when we get to ignorance, we'll see that that is the final one that removes all the afflictions, because they're all rooted in an ignorance that believes that we inherently exist, others inherently exist, all the things in our world inherently exist. Yeah, Lord. Maybe, yeah, to explain emptiness, what I might do is if you can wait for ignorance to come up, and we'll talk about it in that context, simply because it'll be more effective there, perhaps. And always, I mean, it's just to answer it tonight, though, in case you, when we get to ignorance, if you're not here or something, what we mean by emptiness is that we believe that things exist in this kind of intrinsic way, that they have their own identity from their own side, they're self-established, that things kind of have some qualities, identity that are set up by themselves, that we're not involved in that process at all. Because in reality, what the Buddha says is that we are intimately involved with all of that. In fact, everything exists simply by virtue of our imputing things to exist. So emptiness is coming to realize that that topic, emptiness, is that things lack that level of existence. So when we use the word emptiness, we're talking about a negative, we're talking about a negation. That an example that I frequently use is in the dream state. So in the dream state, when we are dreaming, we believe that the objects in our dream are real. If we're not lucidly dreaming, if we're dreaming as we normally do, we're totally caught up in the dream. And then when we wake up from our dream, we realize the emptiness of those dream objects in a slightly different way. We realize that they are not real in the way that they appeared to us. They seem to be real, but in the mind of the waking state, we see that they lacked that way of existing. So that's an example I use to point out what we mean by emptiness, is when we think things exist in a particular way, but we come to see that they lack that they don't possess that. So it's a negation. It's a way of saying that things don't have a particular quality. It doesn't mean they don't exist at all. Or the Buddha would have said, things don't exist at all. You don't exist at all. What are you worried about? You know? But the way things exist is very, very slight, very subtle. Because as I was mentioning just a few sentences ago, we exist by mere imputation, by mere designation. And that's what we'll talk about a little bit when we get to ignorance, because even in our text, it's brought up the whole idea of how we come to realize emptiness through recognizing how things do arise in very various ways. The subtlest way, independence upon our imputation, independence upon conceptualization. So anyway, I'll get to more of emptiness. Emptiness is a huge topic. We won't be able to explore it completely in this text, but it is going to come up in terms of ignorance and how we combat ignorance. Another one that Venerable George used to combat anger is with regard to people who are harming you. Try to put yourself in their place, see them from the point of view of the consequences they're going to experience, and generate love and compassion. So this is very similar to, again, what we talked about earlier that Bob said. And then the final one that he had was to see suffering as a teacher, as your guru. To see what suffering has to teach you in the moment. And if it even is at the level of recognizing that this is something that is evidence of samsara, evidence of what we want to renounce in the end. We don't want to be continue to take rebirth and have to experience these unpleasant things. And that would be a more kind of individual liberation kind of motivation behind looking at suffering. But we can also, of course, recognize that we're not alone in this predicament of experiencing suffering. When suffering comes into our lives, unpleasant things come into our lives, it's a way of recognizing that this is what goes on in the lives of so many other beings. So we can generate bodhicitta from that even, but to see it as a guru, to see, like, what does suffering have to teach me? What is it there for? Because, of course, again, when I use the term suffering there, I'm referring to, these unpleasant experiences that we have. Let me touch on a few more that are from Venerable Sangye Kadro's list. She says, the four were karma, the arrow and the target. The second one was impermanence, this too shall pass. The third was kind of generating compassion by seeing that others will be suffering. They are suffering in the moment in the way that they're behaving. They will suffer in the future by virtue of the karma they're creating, and so on. And then the fourth one, to see suffering as a guru, helping us to develop more renunciation, more connection to others, what have you, bodhicitta. So I suppose all of these, to some degree, are working with seeing our suffering or unpleasant experiences as a teacher, some way to develop some qualities on the basis of that. In terms of other ways to work with it, Venerable Sangye Kadro says, with regard to people who you are seeing as having faults, remember that you would not see those faults if you didn't possess them yourself. So we do this frequently, right? We are really good at identifying faults in others. Maybe not as good at kind of identifying them within ourselves, but if you're seeing them in others, and I've heard this from many of my teachers, they say, well, then guess what? You must have them yourself, or you wouldn't be seeing them in others because you wouldn't even be able to recognize them. So you may not have them to the degree that others have. I mean, admittedly, we all have various degrees of these afflicted, deluded states. But just to kind of let that be a reminder to you that if you see somebody acting really belligerently and you go, God, they're so incredibly belligerent. Well, maybe we all have that. It might not be manifest as frequently or as commonly, but maybe it isn't for them either. And that's the thing, is we often identify people. That's part of this mind of anger, is that it's looking at painting the entire picture as being that belligerent, awful person. I always point out to people that imagine or recall a time, because we all have got a problem table there tonight. We've all had times when we've been horrible to someone else, right? We don't like to think about it, but we've been at our worst here and there. Maybe, again, hopefully not as often as, let's hope that it's not that often at all. But when you think about that time when you were at your worst, if somebody saw you then and you were interacting with them, they would do the same thing that we're doing with those other people, right? Paint you to be entirely that. But you're much more than that. I mean, you're all sitting here calm and smiling right now, so you know that you're more than that. You're not this belligerent, awful, obnoxious person that mistreated somebody at that particular time. That's only a very small portion of who you are. That's a limited experience of who you are. So we're having a limited experience of so many others, right? So why do we identify them as being entirely that? We need to have a whole lot more space in there. Another one that Venerable Sanghi Kadra points out is try to notice the initial feeling of unhappiness that occurs at the beginning of the process of anger developing, and investigate what is happening then. If you're focusing too much on the negative, try to turn your mind towards the good things in your life. So that was a bit of what I was pointing out earlier in terms of these two, attachment and anger, being kind of our polar experiences. When something that is coming into our life that is pleasant, or something that is coming to our life that is unpleasant, it's simply a feeling that is occurring. That feeling is a feeling of pleasure, a feeling of pain or unhappiness. Try to see what is part of the process that we're adding in there. What are all the things that are going on there? When that initial moment happens, if we are able to see it as just a passing, fleeting experience, oftentimes, once more, it doesn't allow the whole process to develop. But as she says, if you can investigate what is happening then, and if you are focusing too much on the negative, really, that's the pathway that starts to exaggerate it, to make it so much more than what it actually is. Then maybe you can start to bring to mind any of these other positive qualities we've talked about, or some other way of framing it so that you see it as something good in your life, or recall the good things in your life, that this is only a small part of your experience in this life. Again, emptiness was mentioned previously, but this is something that obviously, if we can apply it through the depth of our understanding of emptiness, try to see the situation as an invaluable and potentially productive way to grow spiritually. We've touched on this already, but this is something she highlighted as a separate point. Contemplate death, to realize how senseless it is to cling to thoughts of anger, and thus how important it is to maintain harmony and resolve differences. And people die with angry minds. And it's not a very pleasant way to die, I don't think. I can't imagine. I shared this before, but the first instance of road rage I ever heard about, I was living in San Francisco, and I think it happened down the peninsula somewhere, San Mateo or something. And it was two men that had pulled into a parking lot of a 7-Eleven and thought that this one parking space was theirs. And one had pulled in before the other one, and the other one got very upset. And one of the men shot the other one. And that was in the midst of anger, to die from somebody shooting you because you wanted a parking spot. And it seems so ridiculous in looking at it from that perspective, but you know what that mind is like when you get so caught up in you being right, that sort of self-righteous indignation that wants to assert itself in the midst of what's going on. And that's often leads to a lot of repercussions, and death can certainly be among them. So, if we recognize how senseless it is to kind of hold on to all those sorts of thoughts, especially if they're recalling those incidents, and we continue to live with that. There's that wonderful phrase that anger or resentment is like holding on to the hot coal, waiting to throw it at the person who offended you. But you're getting burned while you're holding on to it. The other person isn't even being harmed in the least. I guess there'd be some justification if while you were holding on to it, they were getting burned as well. But you're the one that's getting burned. You're the one that's with this mind, and you could die with that angry mind. That's why, again, it's really important, particularly with those people that we have in our lives, that our friends, family, that we have some disagreement with, that we find ways to, as quickly as possible, patch those things up, to not hold on to those things. People who die with that level of regret, that level of resentment, is not a very pleasant thing. Then she says here further, at some point in the process, it is good to try to counter anger towards other people by developing love towards them. This was what we talked about earlier, again, is kind of generating that thought of genuine loving kindness, opening our hearts to them. But I like how she points out that at some point in the process, this is a much more advanced way to work with it. If you have a particular political figure or whoever in your life that's pushing your buttons, it's very hard to have love for them right off the bat. And you have to begin to really analyze that and to really put some focused meditation into that. And then maybe you can begin to cultivate that. And so then the final thing she says is, finally, in more practical terms, do what you can in a skillful and sensitive way to help resolve any conflict or disagreement that has brought about discord in relationships. This is a bit of what I was just emphasizing. But first, check to make sure such communication will be welcome, and also be very clear about your motivation for engaging in that process. You know, we don't have the opportunity to clear up everything with everyone that has ever offended us in this life. You know, that's not going to happen. But those things that are important in your life and that you feel that you're kind of still holding on to, or perhaps the other person's holding on to, well, maybe it's worthwhile to investigate what would it look like to resolve that. So these are just some ideas. If you have further need for things beyond what we've discussed here, know that there's the wonderful book by Venerable Thupten Chodron called Working with Anger, where she goes through a whole lot of remedial efforts that can, you know, be kind of going against anger and keeping it from arising, and even giving you some tools to help with people who are angry. Obviously, it's not possible to help everyone who has anger in their minds. We don't have the ability to necessarily do that effectively. But it shouldn't stop us from trying to help in those situations where we feel we do have some skill and where there's some openness to that occurring. As she said here, you know, make sure that such communication will be welcome. And be clear about your motivation, that your motivation when you're trying to calm someone who's angry isn't because you're tired of dealing with their anger. You know, your motivation should be because you see how much pain it's causing them to be angry. Yes, Lorna.
Mediation class with him,
Uh-huh.
and they said that when somebody's angry, don't talk real softly and kind to them because they don't think you're hearing them and they get angrier.
Oh.
That the best way to start at a more intense level, talk seems like seems contrary to what we're saying here.
Mm.
You just look at them with love, but they could be thinking that they've been dismissed, that they're not
Right.
taken seriously.
So Lourdes is saying that there was a mediation class that she took where they said when you're dealing with someone who's quite angry, that sort of speaking soft or being gentle won't be acknowledged by them because they think you're not hearing them, and so you should instead present a more forceful way of confronting them and working with them. I guess, again, the one thing I want to say that in regard to that, I don't know much about mediation or about, you know, I suppose that, again, there might be different processes. And I wish I had taken, there was a wonderful course that does get offered occasionally in Santa Fe called Nonviolent Communication. Has anyone taken Nonviolent Communication? It's a pretty common thing now, and they do it in the prisons even, you know, and I guess one of the things I want to emphasize in regard to this is that the way that one speaks isn't necessarily going to be determined by what's in one's mind. So you could have love and compassion and kindness in your mind and speak very forcefully, and speak that intention very forcefully. And so we don't want to get too caught up in being compassionate and loving and kind means that you're gentle and soft and kind of meek in your approach to others, because that's not necessarily what it should look like. Most of us aren't that skillful in using forceful speech from a place of compassion or loving kindness, though, admittedly. So we have to find a way to work with that to be able to express in those terms. But the biggest problem that I see with kind of following that advice in just a general way is that if with this forceful mind we do have anger ourselves, we're angry and upset and, you know, holding the person in that place of somebody that we need to get them to stop and get them out of our lives, it's coming from the vantage point of our own displeasure, our own unhappiness at that experience, then I can't see that we're going to have good results from it, because it's only going to be butting heads, because that's already where this person is at. And if we just meet them at that place, we just keep at it. You know, I've seen too many times where it just escalates, or it just keeps back and forth, and sometimes will even become violent. So I don't know that I'd follow that advice in general. What's most important, of course, in Buddhism, what we always emphasize is what's in our minds. If we can be with others from a place of compassion and care and concern, but be quite forceful in what we're saying and trying to help them, that would be the ideal, because maybe that will help them in that place of their anger and their, you know. I don't know if others have something to share on that. I can't say that I've got any expertise in this. This is what they say, but it takes a lot of skill to be able to work with others at that level. His Holiness often says if you're dealing with people who are being harmful and, you know, belligerent, whatever, walk away, run away. I mean, he doesn't have a problem with just kind of saying, separate yourself from it. There's not a lot of need to get into a confrontation with a lot of people. And people are kind of on their own little trip and doing what they're doing, and we may not be able to help them, but why continue to be a target for them and cause them to be even more and more angry? And they might get more angry with you, and then the next person, that might be the one they get violent with. Who knows? So if we look at it from the point of view, often when I talk about the delusions and how we work with them, the initial line of defense, I may have even mentioned this previously on this Wednesday night class, is to distance oneself from that, separate from the object. And again, that may be where we all have to start, is to recognize that what's going on is a bit too intense and I need to be away from it because I don't have the strength of mind to be able to stay calm, focused, compassionate, kind, and do what needs to be done. So we divorce ourselves from it, separate from it, and develop the skills and abilities to eventually be able to be with it. But if we're going to be with it with the same patterns that caused it to be there in the first place karmically, and that are also what the other person is manifesting, in Buddhist terms, we just wouldn't really see it as being productive at all. It just kind of, yeah, right, right. All right, I understand.
So the mediator himself or herself is not involved. The anger or the conflict that's going on is trying to mediate.
Correct.
But it's saying the mediator needs to force.
Right. Yeah, and a mediator does play a different role. So just for those online, what Lourdes was saying was that this is in the context of law school, where you're receiving some training about how to be a mediator between two parties who are potentially angry, I assume, at each other. They might not be as angry at the mediator, and mediator isn't the object of that necessarily. And you do have a different role to play then, versus when you're the object of that person's anger. But yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I think some of what you're talking about is this notion of acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, if you just listen to a person,
yeah,
it can change the dynamic and the person will calm down.
Right.
Because, a lot of times, people feel like just blowing them off. You're not listening to them, it just makes them angrier and angrier.
Yeah.
If you actually sit there and really try to understand what they're saying, maybe not necessarily agreeing with them, accepting what they're saying, but just that mere fact of sort of keep listening along the lower anger level, and maybe that's part of the process.
Yeah. So Bob was just saying that we can maybe gain from acknowledging that person needs to be heard, and so it's a level of accepting them, hearing them, and that's where, again, a lot of other skills I think would come into play. Active listening and an ability to really hear what others are saying and make sure that those things are being heard by both parties if you are in a mediating role. But again, for most of us, when we're just on the receiving end of it in our daily lives, well, that may be something that we need to address as well. I remember one friend of mine talked about how he used to go to the dog park here in Santa Fe, and he had a fairly large dog, and so some people would come up to him and sometimes just be really in his face about his dog or whatever was going on for them around their dog and all this. And his first comment to them wasn't to get into this shouting match or anything. He'd say, "What do you need from me?" I mean, it's kind of an effective way to diffuse everything, because it puts the onus back on the other person as to what is it that you're really wanting right now, and causes them to kind of step back and recognize, this is their projection of their anger and what have you, but what is it that they really need? How will this be resolved? And it kind of cuts right to that, rather than, no, I didn't, yes, you did, no, I didn't, yes, you did, whatever. So I don't know. I think we all need to learn much more skillful communication. This thing I mentioned earlier, nonviolent communication, as I said, I know they've offered it in Santa Fe before at the Unitarian congregation. They had this, but I'm aware of somebody who also goes into the prisons to offer this. It's very useful to really take a look at how we diffuse a lot of things that can become very charged very quickly. So, any other comments on anger and how we work with anger? And this was not meant to be an exhaustive list. As I said, Venerable Thupten Chodron in her book, Working with Anger, goes into even more detail. Let's move on then and talk about the third on our list, which is pride. I think Geshe Rabtin ends up using the term self-importance. So there are, by pride here, once more, pride oftentimes even has a positive connotation, right? Like the pride that we have in an accomplishment or in our children's accomplishments, others in our lives. We kind of take a heartfelt pride. And even sometimes pride is involved in self-confidence, right? To feel somewhat proud of what one's own abilities are and so on. So we're not talking about those ways that we use the word pride. We're talking about a deluded pride, a pride where we puff up and inflate our own sense of ourself. So let's look at the bottom of page 55, where we begin with Asanga's Compendium of Knowledge, which says, what is pride? It is a puffing up of the mind in dependence on the view of the transitory collection. It has the function of acting as a support for disrespect and suffering. So this involves a little explanation. We haven't gotten to the view of the transitory collection yet. I think I mentioned it last week even. It's one of the 5 afflicted views. I mentioned it last week in the context of the view of the transitory collection and this ignorance that misapprehends reality, misapprehends how things exist. Both of those are not non-virtuous by nature, meaning that they can be together with our virtuous states of mind. Because what we are talking about with ignorance, which we'll get into shortly, is the misapprehension of how we exist, how other things exist. With regard to the view of the transitory collection, we're talking about a specific form of ignorance, a view that we have in relation to this transitory collection is usually the term that's used for the mind and body, the mental and physical aggregates, the components of a being. So there's a mental component and a physical component, and there are many different elements of each of those. When the Buddha taught on the 5 aggregates, 4 of them were mental, 1 was physical. But essentially, these are kind of the components, this transitory collection, this changing set of phenomena that is the basis for a being. So what we are doing is, again, in the teachings of the Prasangika Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, which is the highest point of view in terms of looking at these concepts, which is what we're studying here, what we're doing is we've designated this collection of stuff, this transitory collection, to be an I, to be a person, a self. And we think of this as being an I, but not just as an I in this very casual way that is merely labeled as an I, which is how it exists. I was talking about that earlier, mere imputation, mere designation. In the end, that's the only way this I exists. But we think that there's something much more substantial here that is the I. We think there is something real here that is the I. And this view of the transitory collection is thinking of that I being real in that way, or even the sense of mine, M-I-N-E, that we have with regard to the phenomena that this I possesses. So it's the role of a possessor. It's not the phenomena themselves, because this is only a view of a person. The view of the person that is just simply the I, or the view of the person that is the possessor, that has my ear and my mug and my book and my table and whatever, all the various things that we have this sense of owning, this possession in relation to. So this particular ignorance that we call the view of the transitory collection is the one that is most operative in regard to our experience of samsara. Because it is from that basis of thinking there is a real I here, together with this stuff, that we engage in all these other delusions, that we engage in all the actions that continue to propel us from lifetime to lifetime. So we're going to see the view of the transitory collection come up in the afflicted views, which is the 6th of the root delusions, root afflictions. And then we're also going to see ignorance. But they do have a relationship, but ignorance is the bigger bucket because it also includes other forms of ignorance. But with regard to the ignorance misapprehending reality, the view of the transitory collection is a very specific subset that is about the view of this I that we is merely imputed on this collection of stuff that we think is real, that we think is here in this true way, this inherent way, intrinsic way. Okay, so again, each time we get into these, we'll talk a little bit more about all of this, but it'll become more evident as we get into the actual afflictions themselves. So what he's saying here is the puffing up of the mind that does depend upon that view of the transitory collection. It's on the basis of us thinking there is a real I here that we then puff up this sense of identity of who we are. We think that we're much better than whatever. We're going to see different objects that we compare ourselves to, different situations that we find this pride manifesting. But it's always in relation to some sense of a real I. Right? Because pride is very much something around the I, something around something that we can say there are objects of that too, like the money we possess or the status we have in society or what have you. But those are always in relation to the possessor, or the person who is here, who has those qualities or those traits, those belongings. So it has the function, he says, of acting as a support for disrespect and suffering. We often disrespect others from a place of pride. We don't feel that we can learn anything from them. We feel that they're inferior to us. You know, and it causes our own suffering because it disallows us from really learning from everyone that we meet, learning from all the situations that we're in. So we're going to see this played out as we examine pride further. At the top of page 56, we get the commentary from the writer of our text. He says, just as it has been said above, pride is a mental factor that has the aspect of a puffing up of the mind upon observing the basis for puffing up, one's own wealth, qualities, and so forth. So again, there are many different bases for us to have that sense of an inflated self, to think of ourselves through a prideful lens. Our wealth, qualities, so on, can be many different objects. Here, the Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition of the stages of the path, says, pride is based on the view of the transitory collection and is a puffing up of the mind upon observing an external or internal phenomenon that is high or low, good or bad. It involves an aspect of loftiness. So again, we can talk about a variety of aspects or things that it would be looking at, objects of it, but it always has that sense of some sort of separating oneself above and holding oneself to be above all of that. Again, we are going to see some distortions of pride where we can even think that we're the lowest of the low. That's a form of pride. But it's just you're turning it upside down. That's all you're doing. You're still holding yourself to be in some loftier position with regard to others, somehow unique and I don't know what the other words would be. Some, again, sense of isolating oneself from others in that way. So now we get all these interesting divisions of pride. I found this really quite interesting the first time I studied this, because you don't really think of pride as having that many divisions, but independence on the view of the transitory collection is specified, it says, because all pride is generated in dependence on the innate conception which thinks I. So this is part of the flavor of pride, as I mentioned earlier. But nonetheless, it's of 7 types. The very first one is simply called pride, or our ordinary pride. And the description given here on page 56 is, pride is a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is superior to lower persons. So when we examine, again, this lower and higher, I don't want to make it sound like there's some sort of intrinsic thing around this. It's taking a particular trait. Say one's looking at monetary wealth, right? You know, which is a big thing in our society. And so someone is looking at somebody who is poorer than oneself, who doesn't have the wealth and financial means of oneself, and holding oneself to be superior in relation to that person. So there is a reality that is being identified here, which is the person that is being observed does have less or is lower in that way than the person who is observing. But it's the prideful mind that puffs up oneself in relation to that, which again is a bit of a distortion, because although you might have that one criterion that you can say that you are superior to that person, you don't know all the ways that you might be inferior to that person. You know, this happens all the time when people, you know, interact with those who may not be as well off as oneself, that actually they may have much greater qualities in a variety of other areas. But one is holding oneself to be superior regardless of all of that, only focusing on that one element and puffing up one sense of self on the basis of that. So that's the ordinary way that we often talk about pride. But there is a second and third that are kind of an interesting, these first 3 talk about these 3 dimensions where pride can become even more distorted. The second one is called exceeding pride. It's a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is superior to peers. So here it's like you're hanging out with the people who are in your same class, same social structure, wealth, whatever. The people who, whatever criterion you're using, they are at the same level as you, but you think you're so much better than them. So again, although the basis for it is some level of equality, you're still maintaining a puffed up sense of self in relation to that. The third one is called here pride beyond pride, or sometimes, yeah, there's another term for this. So we'll get to it with Geshe Rabten, I think. He uses another term, I believe. It's a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is greatly superior even to other superior persons. So here it's like, in regard to wealth, you'd be looking at somebody who has so much more wealth than you, but you think you're much wealthier than them. You can see how distorted the pride can be, because it's not even analyzing things correctly any longer. Because just as it wasn't with regard to exceeding pride either, because you're seeing someone that is equal to you and thinking you're better. But it's gone so much further than the first one, right? The first one does have some basis in reality. Again, not complete, not the whole picture. But here it's like, it would be like somebody like me saying, oh yeah, I've got many more qualities than the Dalai Lama. It's like, no way in hell. So somebody like the Dalai Lama in spiritual terms, because we can have spiritual pride too, right? We can think that we have much better qualities or realizations or whatever the case might be in relation to others. So pride can get really, really distorted. And these first three kind of show how it can start off just being based on an observation that's somewhat correct to getting more and more out of touch with reality. The fourth one is kind of interesting because it's really emphasizing this idea of the view of the transitory collection. It's pride of thinking I is a puffing up of the mind, thinking I within observing the appropriated aggregates. So it's just maybe another heightened sense of one's pride in just this I, that I am. We do have again, I don't want to make it equivalent to the sense of pride that people should feel at some level of self-confidence, feeling good about themselves. There's nothing wrong with that kind of level of what we might identify in the world as pride. Where it becomes distorted is where we puff up that sense of self. We think that aren't we the just most wonderful person in the world kind of thing, So this one doesn't necessarily have a lot of criteria that are involved. It's just looking at this I and observing that we think is so real to begin with and making it seem so much bigger and better than it actually is. I don't know. That's my view of, again, this one. But all of these, once more, are thinking I, because they are all involved in the view of the transitory collection. The pride of vanity is the fifth one. This is a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one has attained what has not been attained. So we have that vanity that believes that we've got realizations that we don't possess, or whatever the case might be. Again, in spiritual terms, we can see how this could become really problematic. If one thinks that one's realized emptiness absolutely and correctly and doesn't need to listen to anyone else explaining it, then we may not have realized emptiness at that level, and we may be blind to the knowledge, the wisdom that others can share with us because of that pride. The sixth one, pride of slight inferiority. This is kind of an interesting one. It's a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is just slightly lower than others who are actually greatly superior. So it's like, yeah, I'm almost at the level of the Dalai Lama. He and I are pretty close, kind of neck and neck. Again, it would be ridiculous to say those sorts of things, but this is kind of an interesting one. I don't know that we hear this quite as often in the world, but sometimes people do have that feeling of like wanting to elevate the sense of who they are by talking about the people who are actually much greatly superior to them and kind of identifying them as being in their ranks, right? This is what happens, I guess, in a lot of society where you have name dropping and things and people just trying to show how wonderful they are because they associate with that circle of people or something. I suppose that's a bit of the slight inferiority thing, kind of wanting to hold oneself as, oh, well, I'm at that level, kind of in a sense, or almost at that level. We're going to see some interesting ones when we get to the next page that go into this whole idea of the pride of great inferiority, where we actually think that we're the worst of the worst. Wrongful pride is the final one here on this list of 7. It's a puffing up of the mind. It says thinking that one has attained excellent qualities when one has actually gone astray. So here it's not that you think that you've got these qualities that you may have to some degree, but you have exaggerated them, thinking you've attained what you haven't attained. But here it's the idea that you've even got wrong ideas. You've got things that are not in line with that at all, and you're taking pride in them. thinking that they're such a wonderful thing. So an example would be conceit about having attained excellent qualities when one has actually been possessed by a spirit. Also, the scripture on discipline states to be made conceited by what is actually a branch of shame. To think that one has done so well at something that is something one should actually be ashamed of. So this is wrongful pride, where someone who thinks that they've become the best at deceiving others or something. That would be another way that this pride would be quite wrongful. Just as it has been said, this pride is, for example, an ordained person having neglected the stipulated boundaries of the Vinaya code, which is the code by which ordained folks live, as if he is a lay person, conceitedly thinking that he is benefiting others out of his attachment to gain and honor. So again, to hold to these views that one has gone against what one should be doing and taking pride in that, thinking that it's so wonderful that one has done that. In the case of this monastic who, is behaving as if they're a lay person, thinking that they're benefiting out of others, or benefiting out as others out of some attachment to gain, to honor, to what have you. They often emphasize with people who become teachers, and we're all teachers to some degree, but if you become a more, kind of established teacher in any capacity, that pride is one of the biggest downfalls that you can have as a teacher, because you start thinking about your own knowledge in ways that are different than what you should be. You should always be looking at things from the point of view of not knowing, trying to develop greater understanding, greater wisdom, what have you. So we're all on the path of learning. So it is important that, again, it's not that we don't acknowledge what we have attained or what we have done. That is a healthy part of our path as well, right? To give ourselves credit for the things that we have accomplished and the ways in which we have changed our minds and so on. That often feeds our desire to continue developing our mind. But we can't go to those extremes of thinking that we've accomplished things that we haven't, or certainly in the last one, that we've done things that are actually not beneficial at all, not in line with the path at all. So it says these definitions, this is the top of page 57, these definitions are arranged according to what is taught in the treasury of knowledge. Again, that's the Abhidharma Kosha, and that's where pride is set out in that text in the 5th chapter of the Abhidharma Kosha by Vasubandhu. And then it says, however, the precious garland, once more this text that I mentioned, Geshe Jampa Tekchok's commentary on this, that was published recently, he explains them different, Nagarjuna, in that text as follows, and this is once more from the 5th chapter of that text. Let's read these together. Let's read this whole thing. Actually, why don't we stop here for just a moment? Because it's 8:09. Rather than getting into these, what I thought might be beneficial, because I shared some of the passages from Khensur Jampa Tekchok's book on slides as well. So are there any comments or questions up to this point before I share what Geshe Rabten has to say? Okay. Let me share the screen for that with, I think that's it. Okay. So let's go on to pride. Geshe Rabten talks about pride in a very similar way. So it's a distinct mental factor that, based upon the view of the transitory composite, again, these are Stephen Batchelor's terms for these translations, these terms, apprehending either the inherent I or mine, strongly grasps at an inflated or superior image of oneself. So this is that sense of puffing up that is involved in the mind of pride. He calls it self-importance. And maybe that's a nice way to distinguish it from the pride that's a healthier pride. Yeah, Jerry?
Is this saying that we should eliminate, I feel that we should, I?
Eliminate. Is this saying that we should eliminate I? We should eliminate the false sense of I. Because again, we're going to get into this when we start talking about the view of the transitory collection in more detail. There is an I that exists, that is the simple thought of an I in relation to this stuff. And that's what we call the mere I, or the merely imputed I. And we all have that as part of our identity. It's the basis upon which we fabricate all the other sense of self that we have. all of that other stuff is fabricated. All of that is put on top of it, especially the sense of a real I that is here, meaning that if there is something established from the side of these aggregates that is the self, that is that person, that there's something kind of findable and locatable that is identical to that sense of an I that we believe in so strongly. At the level where it's just imputed, if we were able to kind of get to that level of wisdom where we see that there's just the mere I, which to really get it at its full import, in my estimation, does involve realizing emptiness, realizing the sense of self that doesn't exist at all, to really see the very subtle way that the I actually exists. Lama Zopa says it's almost as if the I doesn't exist. So in answer to your question, I mean, you have to go pretty far in this getting rid of the sense of self that we have, but you don't go to the point of a nihilistic kind of annihilating the I in its entirety, because then the whole path doesn't have any structure at all, because there still is a person who becomes a Buddha, and that Buddha continues to do the work of a Buddha, and so on. We can identify a being that is established in this way, but it's established in the slightest way possible. They say it's nominal existence. And nominal existence is enough for existence. It's just not what we currently know, because we haven't developed the wisdom of emptiness that understands the very subtle way that things actually exist. So yes, we do want to get rid of that kind of chunk of I that we're putting on top of what really exists, which is just a mere I that is designated on the basis of the body and the mind. And the body is a mere body designated on the basis of all the stuff that is the part of the body, and so on. And the head is the designation on, I mean, it's like you never find kind of something that you can say, I found it, it's there, and this is what I can rely upon. Rather, it's always involved in a relative existence, an existence that is a mere imputation on the basis of some stuff that is suitable to be designated as that. Because I can't say I'm here, meaning the computer. You know, the computer isn't me, it's not a valid basis for me, but this collection of body and mind is a valid basis for a person. And then I can think of this as I, and then once more my ignorance layers all this stuff on top of it and makes it seem like there's a real, substantial, self-existent I, and that I doesn't exist at all.
So maybe the computer is the better I.
Maybe the computer is the better I.
Physical.
I don't know.
It's just a reflection.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll go there someday. But yeah, but I mean, the most, because we do talk about when we analyze for that sense of I, looking not just on this collection of stuff, but elsewhere as well. I mean, is it possible for there to be a real I somewhere else? But we don't really have this sense that there's an I in the computer or in the chair or, you know, wherever all these other objects. The place where we feel it's strongest is this collection of stuff, right? You know, because this is what we identify so strongly with as I, as this person. So this is, again, stuff that we'll examine more and more as we get into the other 6 root afflictions, particularly ignorance and the first of the 5 views, the view of the transitory collection. But this is what it's doing, is it's apprehending this inherent, intrinsic I or mine. Again, mine not being the stuff that is possessed, but that possessor, that person who possesses, you know, because that is a big part of the identity of the I, right? It's got just even the thought, my mind and my body. Those are the way that I manifests in terms of thinking of possessing various things. And so we're grasping at this inflated or superior image of oneself. Let me just do 1 or 2 more slides. It's already right around 8:15. But pride has the function of preventing the attainment of any higher virtues and of causing one to disrespect and look down upon others. Thereby, it leads one to painful and undesirable situations. This is almost a paraphrase of what we saw in our text, right? Just a different language. The basis for self-importance or pride is the view of the transitory composite. That is, the misconception that the elements of body and mind are either I or essentially mine. Now this might require a little fine-tuning in my estimation, and perhaps it was even something that wasn't quite translated completely, because once more, what is happening is there is a mind and a body, and we think of this as I, and at the level of just putting the label of I on it, there's nothing wrong. But then we think that that's a real I. that there is something that is substantially, inherently existing as I. It's that if we go to the dream state thing that I used in answer to Lourdes's question earlier, when we have a dream object appearing, we are, through our ignorance in our dream state, we think that that dream object is real as the objects in our waking life, right? That's why we get frightened in a dream. That's why we have desire in a dream. That's why any of these emotions arise in a dream, is because we think that they're real in the way that things are real in our ordinary life. So we are superimposing all of that on that. But there is a dream object, without a doubt, right? Dream objects do appear. Dream objects are simply appearing as an appearance within our dream state, and we are kind of overlaying this sense of reality to them. So it's the same with regard to this view of the transitory collection. There is a sense of an I that we have in relation to the mind and body, and then we think that that I exists in truth, the way that it appears to our ignorance. Because it does appear to exist real from its own side, just like our dream objects appear to be real when we're in the dream state. So this exaggerated conception consequently gives rise to self-important and proud feelings, such as, look at me, how wise I am. You know. So again, maybe we can, I've got a few more slides on this. I don't know that I'm going to be able to finish this. So why don't we just hold off there. What slide is this? Number 97 on my list, and I'll try to make sure that we come back and start with that. So any comments, final comments or questions? We will continue and go back to the text to go through the explanation from Precious Garland, which does have, as I mentioned, that one pride that's kind of like the pride of thinking one is the worst of the worst, which is kind of an interesting form of pride. Yeah, Lorda.
Actually, I went to Japan years ago, and they gave us a cross-cultural class before we went to French people. And one of their explanations was so interesting to me. They said the Japanese believe that the nail that sticks up above the board or below the board is going to get down or up. They want to be the nail inside the board. They don't want to bring attention to themselves either above or below.
That's interesting. That's a nice way to put it. I like that. So Lourdes was saying that there, in some training she had for cultural sensitivity before going to Japan, they talked about how the Japanese, the idea of a board where there's a nail in it, you don't want the nail head sticking up above all the other nails that are in the board, and you don't want the tip down below, because either one is going to get hammered, either up or down, but you want to be resting within the board where all the other nails would be, you know, so kind of, I think it's an interesting way to put it, and that is a nice perspective that we should have. Now, there are some times in the Lojong teachings, the Mahayana mind training teachings, where we use this idea of generating the sense of humility where we see ourselves as the lowest of all. But that's not so that we appear that way to others and that we give this kind of pride of being so much lower, but rather that we always see that it's our mission to serve others. It's our desire to be a benefit to them, to try to help them in whatever ways that we can, and to not let ourselves be confounded by pride in any way. But yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, like an example of these people that take pride in being the lowest of the low might be like, the way football players used to take pride in being able to hit other people harder than anybody else. Or some people take pride in being meaner than anybody else, things like that.
Or being able to not pay any taxes on their tax return, as one person comes to mind. Yeah, Bob was talking about how, this sort of pride that one could have as like a football player that is better at knocking the block off of another player.
Or even a gang member. More cool.
Yeah. Right.
Than anybody else.
Yeah, who can be the cruelest gang member, those sorts of things. Again, these are very wrongful pride, to take pride in things that obviously one shouldn't be taking pride in one's ability to harm others, to deceive others, to do whatever. So okay, good. So pride is an interesting one. I mean, I do find it quite interesting from my perspective when I talk about these different 7. You can see how many different shades of it there are, how it manifests in a variety of ways, and it can be quite subtle sometimes, the way it creeps into our minds. So we need to be very vigilant with this. So, All right, let's go ahead and conclude tonight with prayers, page 235. The first two prayers there as usual, dedicating all this positive potential for our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. And then the second verse where we recall bodhicitta, that motivation that we generated earlier on tonight, and make that strong aspiration that it grow and develop in our own hearts and in the hearts of all beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. 1 second, I had to mute. I think Amy was getting a phone call. So maybe showing up in the recording. Let's go to page 244 and quickly recite these two verses for these two precious teachers to have good health and long lives, and think that we're creating the same for all of our precious teachers. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then finally send out this positive energy to those that you're holding in your heart right now, whoever that might be, people experiencing obstacles or illness who are dying or who have died. And think that through the force of our strong intentions, it becomes the cause for them to be free of their suffering and to have all the perfect causes that will lead them to true happiness and peace. And may all beings know true happiness and peace through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Appreciate you being here. Again, we'll reconvene again next Wednesday.